Okay, welcome. We are here. I don't know who we is, but we are here. We are here. So thank you so much for joining this. For those that don't know, Culturevist is a community of people who are working to shape their culture and people experience. And the idea is there's no shortage of stuff out there, but we're trying to share what are people doing, what are practical examples that we can do in our workplaces. Today is the first iteration of the podcast where we're doing it LinkedIn Live. So we're all on a learning journey together. And when I say that, we're now going to hand over to introductions. I'm really happy two of the community are a special part of this session on measuring culture and measuring culture and people experience. So I'm going to hand over to Lauren to introduce yourself first.
Amazing, thanks, Matt. So, hi everyone, I'm Lauren Gomez. I started my career in companies experiencing hypergrowth. So, I did quite a few years at ASOS and at Booking.com before I ever so slightly dipped my toe into the world of banking just to see what corporate life was like. Since then, though, I've found my home in scaling startups like Learnably and iTech Media. Really helping companies shape the experience that their people have before it gets all too difficult to change anything and everything you want to. But most recently, I've been the VP of People at a gaming studio called Barb. That's just a little bit about me.
Thank you. And Benjamin.
Cool. I'm Benjamin Ennis. I actually started my career as an engineer on the technical side of things before moving into product roles and then dragged into marketing and from that into people leadership roles. And I worked, it's like Lauren, in a number of technology companies during their fast growth phases. So in the era before, I guess, so companies like Cisco Systems and other Silicon Valley startups as they kind of started small and grew before I switched track as well. Kind of went back to school, went back to university and studied psychology and then founded Social Optic, where I'm the CEO. And our mission is to help people work together. So we're all about helping people measure and understand their culture with a view to transforming it for the better.
Okay, we got through the intros. Wanted that. If you're watching and you want to let us know that you're here, pop a comment. I can put the comments on the screen as well when they pop up. But it'd be cool to know if you're here. The way we've structured this and planned it is we can't cover the whole of measuring culture and people experience. It's such a broad topic and one that we're all really into. So we've come up with a few prompts that we're going to have the three of us are going to have a conversation about. And I'm going to put the prompts on the screen as well, so that if you want to get involved, please do share your thoughts and input. It'd be great for us to learn from each other. So the areas we're going to cover are employee surveys, ask me anythings, psychological safety, and other ways to measure culture and people experience. And we have our first comments coming in. Immediately, I've relaxed a lot more now, obviously knowing that it's you, Ted. But no, known people are here. So great to see you, Ted. Hi, Grishma, Danielle, Sophie, Pollyanna. This is brilliant. Okay, this is great because it's already helping it be more of a peer-to-peer conversation. So thanks for everyone being part of this. So let's, the three of us, have a conversation, and please do get involved in the comments, and I'll highlight some of those on the screen. So our first prompt. So employee surveys, what can they reveal about your culture? So we're going to be somewhat structured. I will facilitate for time to make us through, so I'm going to interrupt and that sort of thing. But who wants to take us away first of all on this?
Go on then, I'll dive in, seeing as that's probably my territory, isn't it? I think it's no secret I'm quite a fan of surveys. Kind of discovered those through doing my psychology qualifications, and they get a bit of a bad rep at the moment, I have to say. And I think it's really important not to confuse poor implementation with a poor methodology, as what we say sometimes. They can work incredibly well, but if done badly, strangely enough, they're bad. And I think one of the challenges is that a great idea executed badly looks bad, because it is. A really bad idea executed well is actually worse. And my observation from talking to people who've kind of ditched the surveys 100% going to other things is it's kind of left the gap in their visibility. It's really about understanding what the survey can tell you and what it can tell you about your culture as well. Surveys are still with us however many decades on, because actually when they're done well, they do work. But again, it's using the tool appropriately. So the first thing is, in an organizational context, I'd always say a survey in itself is a piece of communication. So always bear that in mind. Physicists will tell you measuring something changes it. Very much the same with surveys. So that's like the first mistake that people often make is it is a communication, although you're doing some measurement. Treat it first and foremost as a communication before you get going. But it does give you that organizational level view very uniquely at one point in time. And while there's some weaknesses to that, it's a real strength to really understand what's going on everywhere. And it's also something that suits everyone, from the extroverts to the introverts, so that people can have their say if they're not the kind of person who is going to speak out, maybe don't have good communication with their line manager. It's an opportunity for them to say what they experience. And I think that's my last point for now, is that bear in mind, surveys tell you people's opinions. And so that's what they do really well. That works really well for culture, because culture is something people experience. So their opinion about the culture is a meaningful measure. Somebody's opinion around what the sales was last quarter, probably less useful than going to your accounting system. So it's that thing of understanding, opinions are really useful when it comes to culture, because opinions lead behaviors, which lead to what your culture is and your performance. So you want to understand that. But you've got to have a framework for that. So you need to have a starting understanding of how your organization works. Otherwise, you're just putting pretty questions out there. That's probably not going to help somebody. Measurement is about having a specific thing that you're going to measure. So again, start with that, and you'll end up with a successful outcome for your survey.
So we've already mentioned the word culture a lot. Let's just share each of our views, our interpretation of what culture is when we talk about measuring culture. And let's not we won't spend this time debating our definitions, but just sharing it so people are aware. So Benjamin, when you talk about culture, what do you mean?
There's a popular definition, which I'm going to skip over for now, but I will, because I think it will come up. I think that for me, it's like brand. It's an output. So if you ask somebody what brand is, it's quite hard to define. Accountants can define it well, because for them, it's the difference between the value of the asset and the perceived value, because it is a perception. And for me, culture is that. It's the difference between the written processes and what people experience. That bit is your culture, and it's very much an output measure to look at, because it is the sum output of everything that you have in your organization, from people, processes, all those things. It's the thing that you can look at that is the consequence of those.
How about you, Lauren? What does culture mean to you?
I think for me, it is the experience that people have at work. But when I'm talking about it in interviews or anything, I would just say, how are things done here? That's the easier way, I think, of explaining it, because it feels so intangible. And I think if I ask you in a second, how do you think culture is? I think you'd come up with something also ever so slightly different. But I like to distill it down into just the experience that people are having at work.
Yeah, I really like that simplicity, and I guess because I've done so much work in it, I've really got into it. So the way I see it is, it's a force that you can feel, and that force is made up of influences from outside your company. So the industry you work in, you might have certain regulations or laws, or there'll be local laws. So there is external influences that influence how people work. There are internal influences like who makes decisions, how's budget allocated, what do people wear, many different things internally. And then each individual perceives that force differently based on our interests and experiences and beliefs and backgrounds. So it's this force. So when we're considering measuring it, we could look at any of those three areas that influence their culture. Maybe in another session we'll go deeper on culture, but I'd love to hear, Lauren, from your perspective. So what do you feel surveys can reveal about a company's culture?
I think when I think about surveys and culture and trying to combine the two, I oftentimes think that a lot of companies focus on that big one moment, and that can be super limiting. Bearing in mind the time and effort it takes to get a survey together, to get people to engage in it. You're doing lots of comms, you're reminding leaders and pestering them, saying, hey, your team hasn't completed, can you nudge them? That's before you even get the survey done. Then plus you're then rolling it out, and then you've got to actually act on it. It's no surprise that a lot of companies don't really have the time or energy to do it more regularly. But the problem is the fewer times you're doing them, the less they are actually revealing about your culture and where you are, because it's one point in time, as Benjamin said, and it's a snapshot. It's like a window into your company. You could have just done a really terrible comms a week before, or your salary review was the month before, and that will directly influence the kind of sentiment you're going to get. So the more often that you do surveys, I think the more it will reveal about your culture. But it's a double-edged sword because of how much effort tends to go into them. So I often prefer to go deeper and be more specific and intentional about the surveys that we do at work. So we forget that an experience and the experience of work is made up of all these little micro moments. So it could be how someone perceives or experiences how they came into the organization, or when they first onboarded, or their experience of their manager on a month-on-month basis, or I don't know, right up until when they leave. Every single experience you can directly measure if you're intentional about it. So rather than doing like a 50 question survey, which big annual ones tend to do, you can do 5 questions, and that will probably tell you more about that very specific thing you want to know than these bigger ones. So I think in terms of revealing about your culture, the more often you do them and the more specific you can be, I think they can reveal a lot. But I think the broader you go and the more infrequent you go, it's more difficult to reveal anything. But I think it's my key point there, I guess, is it's really tough to reveal anything if you're not checking into specifics or into anything more regularly than just that one point in time. Because 6 months later, when you finished your action plan, that thing that you heard about 6 months ago, it's probably not relevant anymore. So with a pinch of salt.
Yeah, there are a couple of things that when we came up with this prompt that stood out to me. It made me think sort of, they're both kind of, what do they reveal about your organizational way of working around it? So one is doing a survey will reveal how the speed at which the organization moves in terms of from planning to do a survey, to asking, to closing, to taking action, showing people the results of that action, or explaining why you didn't take action. So the survey will reveal what is the pace of the organization for that part of the organization. And then a second thing, doing a survey will, in my experience, it's revealed clarity of roles and responsibilities within a company. So say you do a survey and there's feedback about the catering, or there's a feedback about approval for budgeting, or there's feedback about the physical environment. Those may be like the people to make the change with the authority or the insight, multiple people possibly, they'll probably be in different teams. So is there clarity of who is accountable for each aspect of the organization? Is there clarity of their responsibility to do that? Is the person themselves clear, and other people on who to go to? A third one is the planning and prioritization for that person. So if there's feedback for the senior leadership team, they've already got this backlog or like a list of activities that they're working on. So how and who decides when an action comes out of the survey, how and when is that fed in to their prioritization of when they're going to address it? So they are some of the things that it made me think about. And it was cool to hear, brilliant to hear from Lauren and Benjamin. I'm going to look at some comments now and see if there's any to share or any questions. One thing I've got to figure out. Sorry, John.
I'd say it's one thing. I think that Lauren. I think it's a really important thing about not having your survey turn into a performative drama. And it's kind of like going to the dentist, isn't it? You've got, yeah, if you do it once a year and it's just a thing that happens in that month, people kind of crack on and do it. If people haven't done it for a couple of years, it's suddenly like, oh, just a lot more reluctant. If people haven't done it for 3 years, then, and it's just this whole thing of like building up the problem. So actually having it as just part of a regular cadence just takes a lot of drama out of the process. I would balance that with to what you said about, I think is, it's really important, is don't measure faster than you can move, because it just creates frustration. So it's getting that balance of what is the cadence of your organization, slipping it in. And we have, so in our survey platform, we have kind of change management. So we can see when the questions get edited and how many times. And it's that part of the process is always really interesting, because before you start, you need to establish what leadership think is important, and that is actually part of the process as well. What do we think is important to measure, and do we have alignment on that? It's actually an important part of the process as well. And sometimes that's a bit of like, let's go away and sort that piece and then come back to the measurement bit.
Yeah, and also, Matt, I think you touched on something really important, because you're talking about the things that are almost indirect or intangible, that are not actually connected to the survey results themselves. And when we were talking about this yesterday, we also talked about participation rate and what that in itself will tell you and will reveal about your culture. I've noticed that if you can get from, say, 0 to 60 or 0 to 70% participation in the first 24 hours or 48 hours, that tells you a hell of a lot about how engaged or how really ready your people are to tell you about what their experience is. If your people are really dragging their heels and you are doing all those nudges and saying, hey, can you get this person to fill in your survey, that also tells you a little bit about what's going on. It's almost like a temperature check of your culture, and that's before you even get into the survey itself. And I think that's, these more indirect pulses are quite important as well. And we talked about the importance of participation in the first place, because if you have got, God forbid, like 40% or less engagement in any survey that you do, your data is just not that reliable. But if you're in the 80-90% plus, you can know that you can rely on what you're actually seeing in there is probably a good representation of your company as a whole. But I love what you said, Matt. I think the prioritization piece is so true, because oftentimes you'll get to the end of your results and then it's like, okay, people team, what are you going to do with it? And it's like, hey, we're all responsible for the culture. What are we going to do about it as a collective, leadership plus people team? So it's always an interesting one.
We've actually, for sometimes when we've done an organizational level one where people haven't done it for a long time, we've actually started with the leadership team and gone, we're going to do it for you so you can see what the employees are going to experience. But it was really interesting to then have that discussion with leadership or leadership plus 1, plus 2 around, this is what you think as a group about your culture. Let's talk about that for a while. Can be quite a big change. You don't have to start with everybody. Sometimes it is starting with the leadership team, which is helpful to you as an individual, oftentimes, to understand what's going off up here before we look more broadly.
And there's a great way to test it as well and learn. So Grishma, great comment about the recency effect on survey results. And Danielle, I was told you should never survey more frequently than you take action off the back of the feedback received. Closing the loop on the survey is key too. So survey and then being quiet on results and action plan. Yeah, I think that's a really powerful point that
I could
we're
not
all nodding with.
Absolutely. I look at that and I think, yes, because the first time that you put your survey out there, you're saying, hey, everyone, trust us with your opinion, trust that your voice is going to be heard, trust that we're going to do something with it. And then when you don't do anything with it, the next time you want to survey, they go, well, what's the point? There's no reason for me to actually engage in this because you're not going to do anything with it anyway. And that's the trap. So I think that's a really great, almost like a formula, Danielle. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Luke, I'm really happy you're here. Your comment is going to fill up the whole screen and I don't want to cover my face. So if you want to make it a bit shorter. Listening to this has also reminded me of, I won't say where it was, but I worked somewhere where the senior managers reported the results and they would say, for example, okay, 80% of 80% of you like love working here, for example, but actually it was 80% of the respondents as opposed to 80% of the population, because not everyone responded, only a percentage of people responded. So it can reveal the leadership's communication of results and the vulnerability and transparency they want to give. Luke,
That's a short version. Oh, that's definitely condensed it.
That is concerned.
that'll teach me for asking to make it shorter. Sorry.
I'd say on that measurement thing, I think this is one of my sort of pent up frustrations. I think is the two things. One is always the question I ask, like, so where's the results of the last survey? And it's like, you know, in a drawer or in a distant dusty corner of a SharePoint drive, or like it's up on the wall and in our dashboards, tells you a lot about how it went last time. But I think also it really is worth investing in a little bit of outside help the first time round on the analysis, because you can learn it yourself. But a lot of times I find people who've been thrown in the deep end trying to analyze the data or work with an agency that's maybe not from a data background, and the analysis is really a little bit wonky. And so I think having some help at least the first time round to help you understand what the data is actually showing you, because there are so many little kind of bear traps around that, about sample bias and quite technical things which you can learn, but it is a skill to be learned. You can't just look at the pie charts and go, oh, this means this. There's definitely subtleties to it a lot of the time.
Yeah, thank you. Danny, the reverse is also true, claiming that a high response rate is a sign of positivity or engagement. Literally seeing this with a client today. Yeah, you're totally right. So it's showing here just how nuanced and sensitive, like how conscious you have to be of what you're doing, what you're not doing, how you're doing it, and so on. So thank you for sharing that, Danny. Okay, I'm going to move us on to the next question, the next prompt. So for those watching in, brilliant. It was so cool to have your input. If you've got any questions as well, feel free to post them. So next one, we talked about surveys, what they can reveal. Next is Ask Me Anythings. So Lauren, will you go for this one and maybe share what they are?
Sure. So AMA, Ask Me Anything. It's typically a session that you would run with maybe your company leadership, where employees can ask any question that is on their mind, and emphasis on the any. I think typically in terms of what they can reveal and how, like because it would be company wide, they would be live. So you're getting questions answered, you're getting the questions themselves, but also due to them being live, you can also get a sense on how people are responding to what the answers are. So you might have the comment section on Zoom or Teams. And I guess the big question for me is always, are they anonymous or are they not? I think there's probably three things that come to mind when I think about what they can reveal about your culture. The volume of questions can tell you a lot about how much is not being answered in the day-to-day, and that could suggest a challenge with internal communication. If you're being flooded with like 100 or 200 questions plus, obviously proportionate to the amount of people that you have in your company. Say, for example, you have like, I don't know, a 300-person company and you are getting at least 200 questions. That ratio is quite high. You might think, okay, what is not being answered in the day-to-day? And typically, at least in my experience, I try and theme those questions together. What kinds of themes are coming up? Is there like a ton of questions on reward? 9 times out of 10 there are. Are there a ton of questions on something very specific about company performance that maybe just isn't being communicated that much, and so on and so on. So the types of questions, especially, I think also if you think about not just the content but the tone of the questions, and I think you know the ones I'm talking about. It's the ones that are very borderline, if not outright totally out of order. They could be targeting individuals, they could be just positioned in a way that is just over the line. And I think that's the challenge with Ask Me Anything. It gives people permission sometimes to be an arsehole. and they do take that opportunity, because there is a lot of pent up frustration, and that anonymity is a way to sit behind it and go, well, I now have a forum where I'm very safe to tell you how frustrated I am, and people do take that. And that can reveal quite a lot of contempt potentially for, you know, the company or leadership. And I think that in itself is quite revealing. And I've been in a couple of companies where I've probably had two extreme versions of that. One where people will directly call out individuals, whether it's leadership or otherwise, and say, hey, what about X and Y? And I've also been in a company where I'd say the culture is probably more slightly positive, where the questions are just framed in a more constructive way, even if they are asking about specific individuals. Like, hey, I don't know what this person does. Can you tell us a bit more about your role? It's very different to, why is this person here? They're not qualified. Like, that's very different. So I think that's a couple of things that an AMA can reveal about the experience that people are having. But I also find that, I know we're going to touch on psychological safety shortly, but questions with names attached or not, and this comes back to that anonymous or not, where questions have a lot more people saying, hey, this is me, I'm asking this question, that can reveal a little bit or suggest that people feel more safe to speak up, because they might even ask the hard-hitting questions and still feel comfortable to put their name to it. Can tell you a little bit more about how people, or how safe people feel to ask questions without that fear of repercussion. Obviously, AMAs are only one data point. They are a platform also for your most disengaged people to be particularly loud. And you don't get an insight into your more silent majority. And Benjamin, I know we talked a little bit about this yesterday as well. A lot of people won't ever ask a question on an AMA, even if they don't have to put their name, because they go, oh, maybe I'm not interested, or maybe I don't have a question. And you have no idea what they're thinking. You just get a very tunnel vision view, and again, a snapshot of your culture at a point in time. So yeah, that's my hot take on AMAs.
What are your thoughts? This is to both of you or anyone. So I've worked in companies where there's been a culture that's like the majority will view it as, you can speak openly and honestly, like you can be open, people can speak honestly, like really high levels of trust. Even in those environments, we found that when it's anonymous, people might ask more questions that are on their mind than they would if it was named, even in an amazingly like really trusting team. So an approach that an organization could take is doing named in those public environments where there could be like danger or harm in people like mentioning names, and then offering more of a private anonymous place to ask questions. What are your thoughts, either of your thoughts, about that approach?
Go on, Benjamin.
The anonymity one is really interesting. For the first time recently, we had somebody asking about doing surveys in a way that was completely non-anonymous, where people name their responses, which, yeah, exactly the same. It's kind of where I've raised some eyebrows here, and it made us go away and think and reflect. And my observation on anonymity is, when you're starting, where you may have people who've got a low trust base, you've kind of got to have that, because it gives people the first step towards it being safe to say something. Our observation of projects has been more when we've done things with online platforms and feedback, giving people the opportunity to choose to identify themselves. As things improve, people tend to. So my approach these days is anonymous by default. And if people want to identify themselves, give them a way and permission to do that. That seems to be the best path through the middle, because again, this, I think leads neatly onto the issue of psychological safety and being able to measure culture. And the two things are intertwined in a very tight loop, because that trust and safety is part of culture, but also without it, getting to an accurate measure is difficult. Although at that point, that enough is wrong that intervention is required.
We got some comments. Quite the opposite of the most recent company I worked for, when there were almost no questions in the weekly Ask Me Anythings. It definitely said a lot about the culture of the company. How do you go about increasing engagement in these weekly Ask Me Anything sessions?
That's a good one. I think that's really interesting, actually, to see the polar opposite, where almost no questions are asked. I mean, I'm going to assume, and we know what happens when we assume, but I'm going to assume anyway, that this is where it's still anonymous and you're still getting 0 questions. I think sometimes it helps to create a sort of a snowball effect where you need those first few people to follow. And so you might even want to consider having some questions planted to get a conversation going. What is the most controversial thing going on in your company right now that leaders feel like they should be asked, people should be asking about, and they're just shocked or surprised that they aren't? Feel free just to get some questions planted in there just to get a conversation going. Because once you, I mean, we use Slido in a few companies that I've worked at. You can see how many questions there are. People will start upvoting. You need to always create something that people will follow, because if someone is looking at a blank screen and they're thinking, oh, there's no questions there, maybe my question's stupid. I don't know. That could be one explanation for it. It's something to consider. But I often think that when you don't see any questions being asked, then it maybe is because they don't want to be the first one. It's hard to imagine that in any company there's no questions whatsoever, nothing burning on people's minds, unless you're living in sunshine and rainbows, which I doubt. So is it anonymous? Yes or no? Can you plant some ideas in there and generate some discussion yourself? And also see if you can get managers to potentially ask their teams, hey, what is there anything stopping you from participating in an AMA? Like, what stops you from doing that? People are more likely to trust their managers or more speak up in that smaller group environment potentially. Those would be my ideas.
Yeah, and I think that if you were going to encourage people to ask questions, you could also think about how vulnerable they want to be. So if you want to encourage people to be vulnerable, then have managers or senior managers be vulnerable. It's not saying you need to do it, but it's just something to consider.
It's definitely a thing here that I'm very conscious is kind of easy to forget, which is regional culture, role culture, and organizational culture. And we see it, for example, and look at questions. We know in certain countries, cultures, groups, they're going to answer the questions a little bit higher. Their outlook is a bit more positive. Others a little bit negative. So there's issues of affect, but also there's issues of culture and what is okay. So I remember doing some kind of early versions of AMAs when we used to call them town halls, and where you'd have no questions, be like, oh, this has gone horribly wrong, and somebody took me to one side because it was my first time of working in that region, and said that's not how we do it here. You don't ask a question. You have a private conversation with your manager, and they have a private conversation, so that nobody loses face as we're doing this. Or it's just not, that's not how we do things. We might write you a note. And so being aware that if we come from a particular culture in terms of what's normal from an interaction point of view, that's not always going to be the same in the different places. So I think that sensitivity to regional culture as well as organizational culture is one to really actually have in your sights. We do sometimes lose sight of that.
Yep. Right. Some more questions. So how do you ensure leadership readiness to genuinely engage in this, so it's not defensive when people comment or ask difficult questions?
I mean, I could share a little bit about what I've done in the past. We close the AMA before the time that you're going to host, so that the people who are likely to take the questions have some time to think through the answers. And it's perfectly okay to do that. Not every single AMA has to be taking live questions and answering on the spot, because you're more likely to get a less meaningful answer because people are going to be like in that fight or flight response. So saying, hey, we're going to do an AMA on Friday, we're closing the questions on Monday, is a perfectly acceptable thing to do, because we want our leaders to really think quite carefully about what they want to say in response. Wouldn't you like that too, if your leaders are thinking about your answers before they're giving them? I've also looked at some prepared answers. I've had leaders test them with me. I've had them say them out loud, and I'm like, oh no, you probably don't want to say it like that. Maybe you want to consider taking this kind of avenue. And it's also their safe space. Leaders get to grow and break things and make mistakes too. And sometimes they need a playground or a sandbox to test in. And so when they have that comfort or that safety blanket of having prepared a little bit, and also knowing that perhaps their peer group also support their answers, knowing that it's not just them speaking as an individual, but they're speaking on behalf of a leadership team. Get the whole group together, make it a team effort. That can sometimes help with that readiness, because it can be quite a daunting thing, no matter how confident a leader is. When you're up in front of a company and your questions are absolutely brutal, that still feels like shit. It doesn't matter how long you've been a leader for. So you can help your leaders, I think, by helping them prepare almost backstage. That's something I've found really is quite helpful and quite useful.
And it's a hard one, coming back to psychological safety. I mean, it applies for leaders as well. And I've come across organizations where the board is dysfunctional. And if the board's dysfunctional, the leadership don't feel safe, and really all bets are off at that point. Because it does require a huge degree of braveness, is that the word? As a leader. And again, I say that as somebody who's been in that position, and that could be hard. You feel very exposed, and whilst everyone's thinking about the employees, as a leader, oftentimes you're thinking about the CEO, the board, the chair of the board. And so is a question of how does the culture deal with that? Because some cultures are not open to failure, and so that makes it really challenging. So there is a question of fit of the leader to the culture and where the culture is, versus really brave, bold leaders. And I've worked with some really fun people who are just like, they don't care. They're going to be them. They're going to say what they say. And if people don't like the answer, they'll listen and they'll change. And it's a great way for people to learn about the leaders. But conversely, if you've got leaders who are kind of hanging on and there's frustrations within the leadership team, then you're not going to have that safety for the leaders, and you're not going to get into that point where they can genuinely engage with people because they don't feel safe to do so.
Thank you, Danielle. That we could say so much more, but I'm going to move us on. So Sophie wrote a comment very similar to one Lauren picked up. So what are your thoughts on collecting Ask Me Anything questions before the session versus live during the session? So we've covered that. Thanks, Sophie. Danny mentioned that if there are no questions, you could see questions. Luke, yes, Luke, you made it on. Group size makes a difference too, right?
Yes. Yeah, sorry, that was my immediate gut reaction. I've been in a company with 16,000 people, and a company AMA of that size, it is literally what is the most upvoted, and you get through as many questions as you can in that time. If it's a company of, like, as I say, 200 to 300 people, it's very different. And it can reveal a bit more about your culture. Is what gets most upvoted actually can tell you a lot. This question is what people feel is most important in the company right now. This topic is worthwhile having our leadership answer to. It makes a huge difference, I think.
Okay, it's been fun to explore AMAs. Next, we're going to move on to a theme that's come up and will have a significant impact on what we've talked about, psychological safety. So again, rather than do a whole series on that topic, we thought, okay, how can we what practical ideas or suggestions could we offer if you're trying to improve psychological safety in your company? Benjamin, would you like to offer first? And if you've got any, those watching, I'll share some as well.
So it is that one that's really linked. And I would say it actually starts with listening and showing that it is safe to say, safe to speak, and demonstrating that things are listened to and you're confident to play them back. Because it is about starting to create what I call appropriate transparency. So everybody's seeing everything. That's not necessarily useful and helpful, but actually starting to give people a bit of the background about why things are how they are, and understanding from them why things are how they are, because a lot of the lack of psychological safety and lack of trust comes from people just not being sure what happens to me if I say this, even if it's anonymous. And we have to spend a lot of time sometimes demonstrating to people how, like, this is anonymous and you're not identifiable in those low trust environments. So it starts with showing that if somebody says something you don't like, people aren't going to explode. It's like, we hear that, we've heard that, let's take that away. And the stop as it goes along, and it's such a big thing, but it is so important because it is the kind of starting point of culture, really. I don't think there's any culture that exists that can't be built on trust, or do it the other way around. You need that. Trust is like the corner pin of a functioning culture. If you haven't got trust, you can't build anything else sustainably off of that. You can have sprint cultures, and there's some very highly competitive businesses where there isn't trust as an anchor. They're generally not sustainable businesses. So any sustainable business culture starts from trust, because without that you can't get an accurate measure on things, and you can't lead the organization either. But it starts with listening.
Yeah, I absolutely echo that. And I would start with the listening, but I'd also start with leaders. I think that is where your company's trust temperature is going to be checked at any point. And I think, you can read any article from McKinsey or HBR about the role of a leader in creating psychological safety in the workplace. But I find it fascinating how many companies actually look to your people team to deal with psychological safety. And what training are you going to roll out to help us with our psychological safety is often what we get. And I just find that so interesting, when actually it's a daily thing, an hourly thing, minute by minute thing that is either broken or created or maintained. And it is always with leaders at the starting point. And when I say starting with leaders, I don't mean literally just rolling them all into a training and hope for the best and say, well, you've been trained on it, so you should go out and do it. I mean, try and get your leaders together, maybe in a bigger group or smaller groups, and help them find their own solutions. I think if they ideally would care about the topic, you might have already done a survey that will tell you that your people do not feel safe to speak up. When you put that to your leaders, say, hey, people do not feel like they can speak up here. Why do you think that is? What are we doing? Do we think that is facilitating this environment? What can we do about it? I believe it really does. It does start with leaders, but it is, as I said, it's just fascinating how many times it does come back to people teams to deal with this in isolation, which is sad, I think, sometimes, having been on the receiving end of that in a couple of businesses. But yeah, on the other side, I've been in a business where it really is taken really seriously at the CEO level. And they demonstrate their ability to create psychological safety by being vulnerable, by saying when they've messed up, by demonstrating that when someone asks something really controversial, they go, thank you. It actually doesn't take much to say thank you, but when you do say it and you say, thank you so much for asking that really difficult question, I'm glad you said it. It's been on my mind too, insert answer. And I think what you'll find in many businesses, leaders that are trying to create psychological safety, and if the tide is not going with them, those are the leaders that will often get snuffed out or will get shut down because the environment is not suitable for them to encourage that psychological safety in the most toxic of places. So it's super interesting. It's something we could probably spend at least 10 hours talking about, but I'll probably stop there for now.
Yeah, the thing it made me think is, okay, what actually is psychological safety? What does it mean? What is it and what is it not? And I looked a bit, and one of the things that I saw a few times was like not having fear of punishment or humiliation of making mistakes, for example. So something I'd want to explore is, okay, how does that sit alongside having a high amount of accountability in an organization? So if there's high accountability, for me, that is when something happens, like people are held to account. And I don't know technically if that can happen in positive things, but also things that are seen as negative. So if you want to encourage accountability about, okay, here's what we're going to strive for. We're going to pay you well. We're going to create a great environment. We're going to set targets. We're going to give you this. We're going to create this high performing culture, depending on their view of what that means. But there's accountability. So if you underperform, if you make mistakes like multiple times and don't learn from it and so on, then you are no longer a match for our organization. So how does that fit alongside having psychological safety, where you can talk about your mistakes and so on? Because people might get afraid and have fear of speaking up and saying, oh, I did this, or I forgot to do this. So it's, I think as a concept, I think it's really important, a fundamental one, psychological safety. So my tip would be with people, maybe starting with a small circle and then broadening that circle, try and get a shared understanding and listen to others in your organization for, okay, in our company, what does psychological safety mean, and what level do we want in this company given the goals we're trying to achieve in our business?
I think a challenging one around that at the moment, as people are starting to focus on psychological safety, and this is always the way to some degree, we get something wrong, it becomes like a really popular topic, and then people like overshoot the solution by half a mile. Is, you know, we've seen here people do some things in the name of psychological safety where they've been done at an individual level without a thought to the culture and the organizational level. Psychological safety is an organizational level thing. And sometimes in trying to make one person feel safe, you can make many others feel unsafe. It doesn't have to be that way, but it can easily be done. So I think just the word of caution is always remembering you're dealing with an organization. It's a living, interactive thing. And culture isn't all about leadership, although it starts and ends there, I'd always say. But yeah, just be careful to not try and design individual solutions to organizational problems. And again, to like making one individual happy might make many others unhappy. So, oh, this person was unhappy. We gave them a 50% pay rise. Everybody found out. Now 98% of the people are unhappy. Like, the extreme example, but just to make the point that you've got to design for a functioning culture and organization. And you know, sometimes that's about helping an individual adapt as opposed to the organization adapt, and it's kind of understanding which of those levers you need to pull. Because sometimes somebody might just need individual support and help. You know, they might need some coaching, some skills development to help them get to feel safe, because it's not about the organization, it's about their individual experience. That's fine, but it's just not confusing the two. It's not confusing, you know, not solving that one person's problem at an organizational level, because you create more problems than you solve at that point.
I hope this is helpful. I'm learning from it, and that's kind of a measure. But it will be like at the end, I'd love to hear feedback from people, what we could do differently and what we could improve. Bit of feedback so far. Thank you, Stacey. Love the AMA topic. Thank you for the insight. So we're on to the last part now, which is what other ways can you measure culture and people experience? So the thinking behind this question is, the first two areas we looked at were surveys and ask me anythings. These are both people sharing, like based on people sharing their views or opinions. So it's going through like the individual lens. However, there are many other ways to get an understanding of the culture of an organization that is not going through a person. So we thought we'd each share at least one thing that people could think about. Okay, what are some of the sort of the things we could measure to get a sense of our company's culture and people experience? So who wants to take us on this one first? And if you go on in the comments, I'd love to hear.
Go on, Benjamin, you go.
Oh, go on then, maybe. So one of the things that we've been looking at in the last few years is something called social value, which is really a way of looking at what are the different stakeholders who are affected by the business or organization, and what is that impact, be it negative or positive. And it's been a fascinating lens. And one of the takeaways from it has been that actually, and again, the obvious one is people kind of understand why maybe looking at customer experience and customer experience outputs tells you a bit about the organization. A less obvious one is actually supplier experience, which we've done a lot of work on. How does suppliers view the organization? Because there's a really interesting view behind the scenes. If the suppliers say, you know, they're really fair, straightforward to deal with, et cetera, is a very interesting eye into the culture, versus suppliers going, well, actually, then, you know, we don't feel they're always straight with us, they don't treat us fairly. It tells you a lot about what is going off. But also stakeholders beyond that as well. So I think the externalities of the organization and those people's experiences is an interesting complement to understand what is the output of the culture, and sometimes a useful discussion point with leadership as well, in terms of this is the impact we're having. Do we want to change that? And it does drive culture, interestingly, as you put a lens on those things and introduce those different stakeholders. Like, here's some people we can make a really positive difference to. Do we want to go do that? So those externalities, I think, are undertapped.
I love that, Benjamin, because I also think companies that have values that they say they really stand and live by will be mirrored in the way that they also treat their customers and their suppliers. And I think it would be interesting to see if there is ever a disconnect, how people teams can also help draw that link back together and say, well, we say these are our values, we say these help us make decisions, but this is the impact we're having, positively or negatively, in that way. It's super interesting. I think from my side, I'm always quite interested in company communication, and how often or to what extent company information or updates are shared with the whole company. I've worked in businesses before where it's only the C-suite who are aware of how much revenue that the company was generating, or even how we were performing on a decent level. Even at the leadership team below them had no idea. They saw on like a bar, on like a little chart, like we're at this much up the thermometer, and that has no actual meaning in real money terms. It's like, this is how we're performing, because it was just quite a secretive environment. And the entire business were orientated around lagging metrics. It's really difficult to help in that way. On the other hand, I've worked in businesses where company performance was shared in serious detail every single week. And in the former, people are not trusted. They don't have access to any sensitive information. And this bled into a lot of the behavior and attitudes more widely. And I reflect on that as a more negative indicator of culture. But in the latter, being trusted with information that's open and transparent, enabled other people to have better conversations about what we as a collective needed to do as a team to change that outcome into something that we all wanted. And I always see that as a more positive indicator of culture. But I think you can apply that to any type of communication, whether it's company performance. It could be what happens when someone leaves. It's like the final taboo of your culture and your employee experience. Do people just disappear into an abyss and they've never heard of again? Even when they resign, they just disappear. And I think that's an indicator of a culture that might need some improvement. Or is it a case where every leaver is celebrated, even if it's an involuntary leaver, that they were asked to leave for whatever reason? They're still celebrated in your all hands to say, hey, this person we're parting ways with, this is what they contributed. We're super happy that we had their time with us, etc. That, I think, is an indicator of a more positive culture. And that is just through the types of communication that are or are not happening in your business. I've always been curious about that one. Told you a lot.
Yeah.
Super helpful.
Yeah.
And I think what you thought you communicated and what people thought they heard, and the gap between them, is always fascinating as well.
Yes.
Not through a person is one is looking at the impact of what you're doing internally on the customer. So, for example, if you're trying to work on your culture through doing management development, the customers that are impacted by that manager's work, maybe they're served by that team, or they receive things that have been created by, like, under that manager's influence. Like, seeing, is there correlation between the thing you're doing internally and can you see the impact of that externally? So that's a measure of impact of internal initiatives, which is really important for people teams and other internal teams. Another one is you could look at distribution of decision-making authority. So an approval, for example, is an example of decision-making. So something that a lot of us will be familiar with is the idea that somebody can set up a meeting with 12 people for an hour and it will cost a lot of money. But they don't need approval to do that. Whereas if they want to buy something for £50, they need approval. So what things require approval or sign off, or a business case and that sort of thing? And who do you need to go to and why? So impact on customer, decision making and sign off. And a third one, when I was at a company, we had a hack day, and the hack I did, what I did is we took the organizational chart, like okay, what are the roles, what are the teams, who's where, and then we looked at communication across people in the organization, and then we mapped it. So to look at, okay, are people getting their work done through communication or process or whatever? Are they getting it done with the help of the system you set up, the organization, or are they doing their work in spite of the system? So they're kind of 3 examples, varying in ease or difficulty, but there's so many, but just a few to touch on. We're coming up to the end of the session, so thank you for the comments. I know, sorry, Benjamin. Let's see. I think there's take a look.
I love that thing.
Denison is a useful. Sorry, Denison is a useful starting point if you're new to analyzing culture. It's not perfect. Thank you. It's great to people can link into that. And some other comments about previous, I think the previous section. Okay, cool. So this is, as I mentioned, this is our first version of the LinkedIn Live. Like, we'd all love to hear what you liked about it, what we could do differently. Thank you so much, Lauren and Benjamin. I really appreciate you. Are so, like, you're really key to the community. And when I said, oh, I've got this idea, you were really supportive of it. So thank you so much for being part of it, supporting like me, but particularly the community with sharing what you shared.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, definitely. And it's just great. I love how it is a learning community and like the free exchange of ideas and taking different perspectives, because there aren't, sometimes there are right answers, but a lot of the time there aren't. Different cultures are different. What's a functioning culture for you is different than elsewhere. So learning from each other's experience is just one of the fantastic things about the Culturevist community, I think, that is incredibly valuable.
Perfect. Okay. Well, yeah, thanks everyone for watching. If you want to get involved, pop me a message, and any feedback is really welcome, and we'll see you next time. And now my official sign off.